Welcome to this podcast on the war in Gaza from the International Dialogue Initiative. For our new listeners, let me say a few words about us. The IDI is a private, international, multidisciplinary group of psychoanalysts, academics, diplomats, and other professionals who bring a psychologically informed perspective to the study and amelioration of social conflict. We're committed to opening a reflective space to understand how the background of seemingly intractable conflicts, often related to historical trauma, is being experienced in the present. We've found that respectful attention to large group psychology can help nations in conflict overcome their initial resistance to dialogue and facilitate their moving toward peaceful solutions. I'm Ed Shapiro. I'm a psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, and former medical director and CEO of the Austin Riggs Center in Massachusetts. All three of us on the screen today are members of IDI. I don't need to tell our listeners about the perils that face all of us as we witness the world devolving into violent conflict. In the Middle East, a savage and brutal attack by Hamas has evoked a massive response from an Israeli government that is seemingly out of touch with its civilian population. This unfolding war in Gaza has put other much larger conflicts to the side and resulted in escalating political polarization and an increase in anti-Semitism around the world. Both of our speakers have spent their careers in peacemaking. These efforts have been upended by this war. Peacemaking, particularly around the possibility of a mutually respectful negotiation between Israel and the Palestinians, seems out of reach, while assault and revenge are active. Let me introduce our two speakers, both of whom are founding members of the International Dialogue Initiative, and both are deeply involved in peacemaking in the Middle East. Lord John Alderdice is a psychiatrist, political leader, and academic who focuses on conflict issues. For more than a decade, John was the leader of the Alliance Party of Northern Ireland. He played a pivotal role in solving the bloody and prolonged crisis in Northern Ireland, and he was one of the political leaders who negotiated the 1998 Good Friday Agreement, following which he became the first Speaker of the new Northern Ireland Assembly. In addition, he's been serving for more than a quarter of a century as a life member of the House of Lords, the upper chamber of the UK Parliament. Currently, he's also executive chairman of the Changing Character of War Centre at Pembroke College in Oxford. And for the past 10 years, he's been hosting annual conferences at the University of Oxford on the resolution of intractable conflict. John travels extensively to speak, consult, negotiate, and work on the resolution of violent political conflict in various parts of the world, including in the Middle East. In 2015, John received the Liberal International's highest honor, the Peace for Freedom, and in 2022, the Lifetime Achievement Award of the Royal College of Psychiatrists. Dr. Robbie Friedman is a clinical psychologist and group analyst. A former president of the Group Analytics Society International, Robbie has recently received that organization's Peace and Dialogue Prize for his lifelong efforts to develop dialogue between groups ranging from descendants of Nazis and their victims in Germany and Israel, to Russians and Ukrainians, to Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland, and to Jewish and Arab Israelis and Palestinians. Robbie is a co-founder and past chair of the Israeli Institute of Group Relations. Let me begin with a question for both of you. Why has this conflict in Israel pushed other larger conflicts to the side? What makes this war so significant to the rest of the world? Who wants to start?
Well, I'm happy to kick off, Ed. I'm not so sure that it has pushed other conflicts to the side. Although it's getting a lot of attention, it seems to me that it has become part of a wider global conflict. When I and colleagues were working on the problems within Northern Ireland, the zeitgeist of the time was of political leaders, global political leaders, who felt they were leaders because they were resolving conflict. And so you saw progress in South Africa, in Northern Ireland, and indeed at that time the Oslo process in the Middle East. But that situation has changed, and global leaders now see themselves as leaders because they conduct conflict rather than resolving the conflict. And when we look at what is happening with Russia, Ukraine, what is happening with Israel-Gaza, of course, and more widely in the Middle East, and of course what we fear may be developing between China and Taiwan, it is all part of a wider change, a wider deterioration in the global relationships. And some of that is understandable as we moved, first of all, to after the Second World War, to a bipolar world where the two great nuclear powers were confronting each other and not prepared to go to a hot war because that would mean a nuclear war. So we had a Cold War and various vicarious conflicts. We then, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, found the United States as the global hegemon and holding control, and to some extent wanting to hold control. But of course, that ultimately could not last. And as the wider global situation changes, as other powers wish to come forward and have their place in the sun, as the United States is unable and to some degree unwilling to act as the global policeman, we find the whole situation deteriorating and wars emerging, in some cases re-emerging from the past. And I see what is happening with Israel-Gaza in that larger context. And of course, when you look at it, if you talk to Israeli government officials, they will also talk about the situation with Iran. Iran is also providing drones for Russia in Ukraine. It's also the case that China is providing some degree of assistance to Russia and a good deal of opposition to the United States over Taiwan, and so on. And what is happening is that the world is becoming more deeply divided and more profoundly dangerous. I think that people are focusing on the Israeli question at present, not so much because of it of itself, but because of what it means. And one of the significant developments is that much of the world is no longer prepared to accept that Israel will be an undeclared nuclear power, will have control not just of that area of territory which was agreed by the United Nations, but extending its territory and so on. And relations are deteriorating very fast. And so I think people see that conflict as a marker and contributor to a wider and extremely dangerous geopolitical conflict.
That's an extremely helpful, larger perspective, John. Thank you for that. Robbie, you're in the middle of the conflict in Israel. What do you think about its status and its preeminence in the minds of the world?
I agree to the political analysis and the division of the world. Actually, part of this is also reflected in the name IDI, because we started as a dialogue initiative between West and the Muslim world, and I think there is also some part of it there, although I think some in the West wouldn't want it, but I have the feeling it also is there. Israel is always interesting because of being the religious center, in a way, of much of the world religion, three large religions, not all. And I have the feeling it's still there, this issue of being so important. There are two other things. I mean, first, I would say that every time, every episode and every war, there is another focus of this problem. For example, in '48, it was already interesting that the war of independence and Israel's independence and the invasion of the Arab forces. And why? Because it was after the Holocaust. Now I think it's different. There is an attack of terror. There is no possibility that people in a liberal world are attacked and they don't see themselves in some way affected by it psychologically, because this happened already a couple of years ago with ISIS. This is a big thing. Israel is very, very affected, all its citizens, Jews as Arabs. But I have the feeling one part of this is the effects of this. It's the effects also on the war itself, the terror, and this kind of feeling that you have to repair something, defend something, revenge something. All this together is making this war to a very, very strong issue which seems worldwide. And yes, I think it was a couple of weeks ago. The attack was as an attack not only on Israel but also on the Saudi-Israeli relations and on this whole axis which was built. And I have the feeling that it's a question what will happen there.
Yeah. My hope for this conversation is that we will move towards the question of peacemaking. But first, I want to take up something, Robbie, you have written about. For our listeners, Robbie's written about the psychology of war and the impact of violent trauma on a whole population's thinking. He calls it the soldier's matrix, where everyone from children to old people become a soldier, losing touch with empathy, guilt, and shame, all of which is pushed aside by feelings of revenge. This, I think Robbie suggests, is one of the powerful problems of the ongoing war in Gaza. Robbie, can you tell us what a soldier's matrix is and what you've now learned about it in the middle of this war?
Well, you said it. I try to describe how this war or a war situation looks like in a society. And the soldier's matrix actually sometimes it's a dormant thing. It sleeps because mainly I think that if you are a liberal person, you have to sleep. You cannot be paranoid all the time. There are a lot of soldiers' matrices who are dormant and latent, and then something happens. Usually, there are two big issues that happens. One is annihilation anxiety. When annihilation anxiety, like now, happened, you see the whole country, the whole people, the people in my praxis. I live in a city where Jews and Arabs live together, and I have patients in groups and you see it everywhere. There is no way to escape it. Or sometimes it's the promise of glory. If you have some glory, glory is you can conquer something. You can see it in the Second World War. You can see it in Russia, in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. So when this happens, what happens in general is that there is a selfless effort and engaging in war. Everybody becomes a soldier, as you said. Women, men, and your own life seems to be not important. Now, Israel is a soldier's matrix of a special kind. We'll talk maybe more about it later, but this kind here is that you have sometimes the feeling that you can you can sleep. The army will do the thing. You will be defended and so on. And of course, Hamas is a soldiers matrix. Is a very strong soldiers matrix. They have their own tasks and things and ideals. And the question is, what happens in this? Because at the beginning, everybody is engaged. Now, in Israel, for example, after 3 months, you see that there are changes. I work with Ukrainian. The soldiers matrix suddenly erupted. They didn't believe that they will be attacked, but then they were attacked. And then one matrix influences the other. And now there was a year where I worked with them that they were in a different annihilation situation, threatening situation, and the Ukrainian now getting back because of this rockets attack, which are more and more often. So what happens? One of the questions is how it is evolving. It's the soldiers matrix is a process, and it, for example, it took the German soldiers matrix, 2 generations almost to go down to other for the people, social places where, for example, what you said before, shame, guilt, and empathy could change. It started before, but you see this, and when I look around to the Israeli soldiers matrix, and certainly to the Gaza soldiers matrix, to the Hamas soldiers matrix, it's interesting to think about it. How that can be changed, or will it be changed?
I have some personal experience of this too. I work with a group of Ukrainians in the middle of Ukraine. And as the war began to unfold, what I saw actually quite surprisingly was their hatred for everything Russian. They tried not to speak Russian anymore. They want to speak Ukrainian. They don't want to listen to Russian music. They can't tolerate Russian poetry, even Russian literature. It's like an obliteration of anything connected to the enemy. You wrote about this, Robbie, very evocatively, but now you have some personal experience of it. Has this changed or deepened your understanding of what this means?
Unfortunately, I hate to say that the things you see in small ways 10 years, 20 years ago, now they happen. It happened on both sides. I mean, on the other side, this rape and this violence and this atrocities and this hostage taking, you see how they are. But the influence of this war on the other side is crazy. The army, who should, I think, stay as a thinking institute and not as a revenging institute, it works like at the beginning in the soldiers matrix. There is hate. There is the young people are willing to die for things a year ago, half a year ago, they didn't think they have to die for. So this atrocities on both sides are really something this is very clearly happening, and in a year from now the situation will change. It will not change as it will in a decade, but in a year we will already have a lot of people who will ask more and more, what about, for example, the Gaza population, the civil population of Gaza. I just want to say that many times I thought, why didn't we intervene in the Hamas dictatorship, in this place where there is a terror? For me, it's clear why my government didn't intervene. My Bibi, I think the government wanted some kind of a dictatorship which can give you the ideology justification that you have to have a strong army and you don't have to deal with any diplomat. But why didn't we, the left, the liberal part, demonstrate against this dictatorship like we did against our government, our own government in the reform? Why didn't the liberals in the war, in the world, say something about this terror? They didn't only hate the Jewish people, they killed Fatah people. 2007 until 2009, they finished everyone off. So these are the things I'm starting. I wonder what you think.
John, you have a lot of experience with this kind of regression into savagery, both in Northern Ireland and as you go around the world. What do you think about the impact of this kind of regression, psychological regression, and obliteration of empathy on the peacemaking efforts?
Well, there's a lot that one could say about it. The first thing, I suppose, is to pick up on your reference to this deterioration, and certainly from an individual point of view, it is a deterioration and a loss of all the qualities that Robbie mentions. And one certainly does see the pattern that he describes as the soldier's matrix in all sorts of situations where communities feel under threat. And that may be part of the indication of why this happens. If this is such a deterioration, one might say, well, then why in evolutionary terms does it continue to survive? And the answer, I think, is because in evolutionary terms, the question is not about the survival of any individual, it's about the survival of the large group. And in order to ensure that the large group survives, many individuals may have to die. Many individuals may have to sacrifice themselves. We know that this is just simply reality in terms of war and conflict and so on. And even in less divided and violent situations, people may have to some degree, sacrifice themselves during privation. Parents have to sacrifice themselves sometimes to go hungry because they want their children to survive and there's a limited amount of food. There are all sorts of ways in which the survival of the community and the survival of the individual may sometimes be in conflict with each other, which is something that liberals in particular have an enormous difficulty in appreciating and understanding and working with. So that's the first thing that I would say. The second thing is that once you get into the situation that Robbie describes, where people are fearful about the survival of their community, and they begin to think in all of these ways, then it's very difficult to intervene in the way that one normally would try to do where there was a relatively peaceful situation, but a bit of a disagreement. And one of the ways that we found to be crucial in Northern Ireland, and I think as we look in other places, it's also crucial, and that is to try to look to important relationships outside of the immediate conflict and try to build relationships there. So, for example, what was crucial was that the British government and the Irish government found a way of engaging with each other. And by both Britain and Ireland joining the European Union on the same day in 1973, all sorts of new relationships were able to be built up at the level of prime ministers and senior civil servants and others. And eventually they began to say to each other, you know, we could find a way of working together to resolve this problem. And we think that our friends in Europe, and very importantly, our friends in the United States, are of a similar mind. So let's get together. Now, not everybody was of that mind. There were supporters of the IRA in the United States who didn't find that appealing. But once you got a president like, for example, President Clinton, who did see himself as someone who could resolve conflicts, then you were able to to bring not just Britain and Ireland, but the United States and the European Union all together to provide a protective context in which the various different people on the different sides in Northern Ireland could begin to engage with each other. And the same thing is true, for example, over Kashmir with India and Pakistan, or over Cyprus with Greece and Turkey. You're never going to be able to resolve these things only addressing the immediate partisans. And that's why for many years I've taken the view that it was important with Israel-Palestine to address not just powers like the United States and to some degree perhaps Europe and others, but also the frontline Arab states, to try to get some kind of accommodation and agreement which would not ignore the concerns of either Israelis or Palestinians, but would try to create a context where it was possible to see things in a different way, to be more hopeful, to be less terrified about the future. The problem of the moment, of course, is that there is not such an external approach. There appeared to be a development between the United States and some of the frontline Arab states, but the problem about that was it was an approach that ignored the needs of the Palestinians. They were specifically excluded. They were not happy about it. And to some extent, I think that has contributed. It's not the only thing, but it is one of the contributors to the explosion of violence, because Palestinians felt that they were just about to be abandoned by the Saudis and others in favor of economic benefits by having a better relationship with Israel. And now the whole thing has exploded and it's kind of gone all over the place. But that's how I would describe the context you need to try to create. At the moment, there is no context for engagement. There is no context for resolving the problem. But what we have to try to do is maintain, nourish, and insofar as we can, build channels of communication, which will ultimately, we hope, create the possibility of engagement, as long as we do not completely destroy ourselves. And I have to say that in the context of the Middle East, I think that there is an existential crisis for a number of groups there. Israel, Robbie has already referred to that kind of sense, but there is that sense for Palestinians. There's particularly that sense for Christians in the whole region, whose numbers have been going down and down and down. And that is potentially disastrous, because the third element in a relationship always produces a new and more constructive possibility. Once it gets reduced down to Jew versus Muslim, it's actually much, much more difficult to resolve than when there are Palestinian Christians as well as Palestinian Muslims. So there's a lot to explore and talk about. And frankly, for the moment, a great deal of patience and trying to maintain such relationships as we can is what's crucial.
There are two things that you touched on, John, that I'd like us to explore a little bit more. The first is what you ended with, the Christian voice as a third party. I wonder how powerful that voice is, how it's represented, and how it gets the possibility to speak. But the other issue that I'd like you both to respond to for our listeners who may not have this kind of notion in their minds. The IDI is formed around understanding of what we've been calling large group identity. This is a notion about large group psychology that our founder, Vamik Volkan, has written extensively about. And you touched on it as a powerful mobilizing force, both of you. Maybe you could say something about that before we think about the third party voice.
Robbie, would you like to pick up on that one first?
Well, it's a good example, the Christian issue. And actually, the third issue is a very good question. Who could be a third in this conflict? Because we have to look at bridges to take us away from what we have, what we are experiencing now. Now in Israel, I live in the north. In the north, about half of the Christian population has left already because of the feeling, much of the feeling, but a lot of inner Palestinian, let's say, conflict, also in cities like Nazareth and others, when they lost the majority. But still, right now, in the last, I think, 5 or 7 years, Christians are again leaving less, at least. You see this. In my city, you see this. Now, one of the issues is that the Christians still, together with the Muslim population, they don't have a real voice. I mean, it's a development who started in more or less 65 when the military government for the Arab population stopped after the war. It took 15 years. And you see, in the civil society develops, and the civil society in Haifa and in other places, it mingles more and more and more. They work more and more and more together. But they don't have a place in the government. Having a place in the government would be very, very important for us, not only internally, but it would be very important for us for the collaboration with Palestinians. Because Palestinians, right now, they see, and the world, they see the Arabs not participating in the political, or not enough participating in the political life of a state where they are 20%. I think the Christians are about 7% of this, but they are a very, very important part because they are usually socioeconomically median and higher class. They are, just personally, I have a new neighbor. He lives 100 meters from me now. They are Christians. They bought a house in my street 20 years ago. So you wouldn't believe that this is possible. And he cooperates. He lives there. They are part. They are not the only ones, and you see it everywhere. Actually, the civil society integrates better than the governmental efforts in Israel, because the governmental issue, they are all very extreme right now. It's not only it's 20 years of getting right of a Likud government, more or less 20 years. So what I want to say is, in general, I would give the Arab population more space. I think the more space they have, the inner group conflict between also Christians and Muslims will lessen, and in general, it will give us one of the big bridges to the other Palestinians, because in the end, you will have to find some solution. Will be one or two state solution. It will be one state solution, like a canton solution, like in Switzerland or in some other, or a two-state solution. It's very unclear, but you will have eventually to find the solution.
You know, the question you raise about the Christian voice uh, makes me think about my own country. We represent three countries here: Israel, Great Britain, and America. And in America, the Christian right is powerfully supportive of Israel, but it does not, as best I can tell, mobilize itself as a third voice. And so the desperate need for a third voice in a polarized conflict and the potential use of Christian voices, how does it get represented? What do you think, John?
Well, I think it's very problematic, not just for some of the reasons that Robbie mentions within the Arab community, but it's quite clear that there is within the Jewish Israeli community, in the place that is holiest for all three traditions, Jerusalem itself, there are very active attempts to drive the Christians out. Their churches are being damaged, their property is being purchased in order to be turned over to Jewish nationalists. I remember some time ago when I was visiting some of the church leaders, the Armenian patriarch telling me that the Christians would be driven out over the next number of years. He could see it happening. And let's remember that the Armenians have been there since the 300s, not the 1300s, but the 300s. And so the idea that this is really just a piece of territory for one bunch of people doesn't stand up to any kind of historical scrutiny or even religious scrutiny, but it certainly doesn't stand up if one's trying to build positive and constructive relationships. And those are in pretty poor shape. When you talk about the religious right in the United States, you're talking largely about the Christian, particularly conservative evangelical community. And one of the things that's quite interesting about them is that they have absolutely zero feeling for and understanding of their co-religionists in the Middle East. None whatever. Part of this, for some of them, is because of a kind of eschatological view, which is that actually what they want to welcome in is the destruction of everything in Israel through Armageddon. And they see it, of course, updated to be a nuclear Armageddon. And you have even seen presidential candidates speaking in these kinds of terms. So they don't want any kind of peace settlement. They want things to come to a cataclysmic denouement, which will welcome in the Messiah. And the commonality is the Messiah. It's a different Messiah that they're looking for, of course. But that's the common. But they have absolutely no appreciation or understanding of Palestinian Christians, whatever, or even other Christians in the region. So I think while it may well be true that in some areas, as Robbie mentions, some Christians are beginning to settle again. In other places in Israel and in the rest of, and in Lebanon and so on, and other places, they're leaving. And it's for me extremely dangerous that this is happening. But part of the problem is that both internally and externally, there has not been a wish to see a resolution. I mean, I got involved fairly intensively with all of this after 9/11 and was meeting in 2005, not just with Jewish leaders, but with leaders of Hamas and Hezbollah and others. And it was absolutely clear to me at that time that there was a possibility of reaching a major cessation of violence and a commitment to stay away from violence on the basis of a political settlement. And people in Hamas, leaders in Hamas and Hezbollah made that very clear to me. But what was also very clear was that that was not of interest to the United States at all. And they did things to frustrate any of the efforts we had. It was not the position of the Israeli government, who dismissed anything of that kind. And frankly, it was not, in a rather more dishonest way, the position of Tony Blair and the British government at that time, because he expressed an interest, and I talked to him a number of times about this in number 10 Downing Street, and he said, if there was an election and a government of national unity formed amongst the Palestinians, then we would be prepared to engage, which was not true. They weren't. There was an election. Hamas won the election. Nobody ever really made any complaint that it was not a fair election, but the outcome was not an outcome that the West wanted. Hamas won. There was an attempt to deny that and put Fatah in. Then there was the violence that Robbie mentioned, and there's never been another election. And the West doesn't want an election because they think that the same kind of problem would arise. So I think that we're in a very dangerous situation where efforts to address these things have been purposely destroyed. Now, are we going to come to a place where people realize we're on the edge of an abyss and draw back? Well, that is absolutely possible. But like any of these other things, you can't predict what will happen. I don't believe that any of the powers that be in the region actually want a cataclysm. But I think that was also true in 1914 in Europe. I think it was also true in 1939. But if you don't find yourself doing things to stop it, then you hurtle headlong into the abyss. And that's the danger.
John, some of the things you just reviewed, including the pushing out of the Armenians and the taking over of property, are a consequence of Netanyahu's right-wing government. Robbie, you want to say something about how that has developed and sustained, and how you think it's going to be going forward?
Well, the history or the history of the emotional or the politics is that there was an ups and downs since the 30s of the belief if Arabs are really accepting the existence of Israel, or and it could be uh, negotiated some kind of political issue, peace or coexistence, or it was what is called today the two or three stages development, where even someone who says he wants to make a deal with you, in the end, he wants, like in the Hamas in the Hamas contract, or how do you call it in English? It says there they don't want another political entity between the Jordan and the sea, which means no Israel and no Israel people. So this conflict actually changed spaces. For example, Ben Gurion was sure at the beginning that there was a possibility, after talking to Faisal and after losing the Sinai again, after he conquered it together with the British and the French, and and you see it in his writings how suddenly he understood that he cannot refer only to Israel as a military place, but also as a place, as a space who tries to live politically together with other people. And this comes ups and downs. After the Six-Day War, it had a big down because Israel felt so secure because of this army, and it is abused. This understanding is abused in the last 20 years by Netanyahu because of the failure of the contracts, all the big contracts which were in the 2000 at the beginning, and or in the end of the 90s, and now again 20 years there was no move in the political scene, and this is a catastrophe. Actually, part of this catastrophe is that this government is helping really extreme places, extreme people, to believe that they can take parts of expand or buy or find some way to make more and more villages. And I think this is a big problem. How will be the future? I don't know. I can't believe that this is a situation which the liberal part of Israel can live with, because actually the liberal part of Israel, which is half of Israel at least, is both working more than the other, is earning more than the other, is having their children and themselves in the army more than the other. And we have so many things doing and paying for the others, it is crazy. So the people who demonstrated, not all the people, not everybody, but a lot, I mean, I'm sure more than three-quarters of the people who now are in the army had defended. Surely those who defended the first day of this war, where my son-in-law died, all these people, they will not agree. They cannot agree to live like that. Now, if we are successful, I really don't know. But I know that this struggle who started a year ago, at least a year ago, when it became clear that the left has slept twice. He has slept towards Netanyahu and his people, and has slept towards Hamas and his people.
Do you feel hopeful? Do you feel hopeful, Robbie, about a liberal government following the war?
I, I'm always trying to be optimistic, and I know that sometimes a big catastrophe in politics brings to it, because some of the people understand that it's impossible to continue like that. But I cannot tell you. Yes, I hope very much. But then there will be a lot of work towards the Palestinians, towards the Palestinians living in what we call the Christian and Muslim Arabs. Something must be done, for example, with the religions. I would very much like you to say something, John, because for religious people, to have a religious leader who pushes them to peace, it's different than to those who push to. I heard the leader of the Islamist party in Israel. He was the only one who got into a government a year and a half ago. I heard him talking with the Hamas on the radio, and I know what he said. He said, "Change your style, change your attitude, and we will earn more with that than with all the arms." And we need this kind of work. And I don't mind now that if the big rabbis of Israel are now it's soldiers matrix also for the rabbis.
Yeah, I too wanted to ask you about this, John. The the fundamentalists of all three religions have had a massive voice and power in this conflict. What's your perspective on that?
Well, of course, you're absolutely right. Both of you are right in what you say. I think that one of the problems that has been a very major one in this particular region is a consequence of the Second World War and the Holocaust, where many Christians, for very good reason, felt guilty about what had happened and felt that they needed to some degree, to give Jewish people a break. Christians had not treated them well. Many Christians, not all, but many Christians had not treated them well for a very long time. And then we had this utterly horrible business of the Holocaust. The problem about that was that it meant that no boundaries were put on the behavior of some of those who were more extreme. And for example, as Robbie points out, there was no equal requirement within Israel itself for all of its citizens to pay their taxes, to engage in the educational system as a whole, to be prepared to serve in the IDF, and so on. There was somehow a special place created for people who didn't engage in those kinds of ways and who made the plea that this was for religious reasons, despite the fact that there were very many religious people and very committed religious Jewish people who were perfectly prepared to pay their taxes, get involved in the educational system as a whole, serve in the IDF, and so on. But somehow or another, this was too sensitive. You couldn't touch this. And I think that that's actually one of the major problems about addressing all of this. And Prime Minister Netanyahu has built a whole approach on this by saying repeatedly to people inside and outside the Israeli community, if you criticize Israel, that's anti-Semitism. And the corollary is exactly what was being said earlier on, I think perhaps by yourself, Ed, and that is that when eventually the whole thing explodes, as it has done, you will get a massive increase in anti-Semitism because people have been holding back and holding back for fear of criticizing Israel because of being called anti-Semitic. But all those feelings and thoughts are there, and somehow once something is breached, it all explodes all over the place. So it's disastrous. And that's the kind of position that we're in. Now, there are many religious people who do not hold to these fundamentalist perspectives, but fundamentalism is a kind of way of thinking which is not restricted to religious people at all. It happens with all sorts of groups of people who think in this way. And secondly, it is often increased, exacerbated, or makes its appearance when there is a sense of existential threat on the community. And this can then be traded upon and built upon. But there is a sense of anxiety and threat. Now, just by removing that threat, you don't automatically get rid of all the fundamentalism, because once it beds itself in, it's very difficult to get rid of. But there is a connection. But it's very important what you've pointed out, that there are religious people who are utterly opposed to that whole approach. And then there are religious people who utterly espouse that kind of approach. So it's not, in that sense, fundamentally a religious question in terms of religious adherence, but it's a way of thinking and being in the world. Now, one of the difficulties is that people on the more liberal side that Robbie referred to have tended to simply hope that if you understood everybody's anxieties and concerns and spoke to people, it would all settle down, and it doesn't. Liberal societies have to be fought for every bit as much as any other kind of society. And that means setting down boundaries to people's behavior and often disagreeing with people. And that's a thing that liberals have an enormous problem with, to be honest. They like to think that there's some kind of structure or settlement that will permanently ensure that people have good relationships. And all of the three of us know very well, and all our colleagues in IDI and the wider psychological community know very well, that relationships are not something that can be put into place permanently. There's something that has to be worked on all the time and nourished and protected. And if there are going to be better relationships within Israel, whether it's between more fundamentalist Jews and more liberal Jews, or between people in the Israeli and Palestinian communities, or whatever, that has to be worked on and built on. There isn't a system that will ensure that, whether a military system, an economic system, or a political system. None of those will of themselves ensure good relationships. They have to be worked at in themselves.
What are the chances of that, Robbie? What John's talking about is the exclusion of Orthodox Jews from full participation in the society. They're given a pass, and their population has increased, I gather, faster than non-religiously committed Jews, which raises a powerful political problem. What's your sense of the future of that dilemma?
Well, actually, they also in the Arab society, the population of the religious segment they have more children, much more children, and I don't think the question is to take them out. I would like to treat them as you treat them in the United States or in UK. You can do whatever you want, but you have to pay taxes. If you don't work, you don't get money. We cannot give more money to people who to live than to students. I can give you you can learn for 4, 5 years, 10 years, 8 years, but you so. One of the questions, it's not to take them out of the system. One of the questions is how to help them by the normal aspects of taxing and so on, to live a life, so this is one thing. I have the feeling that we have sometimes done work in groups that will return. Now it's impossible to sit together. I wouldn't say it's impossible. In my therapy groups, we had 1 month of fighting for our groups. So this is not for the general. In my therapy groups, the Arabs and the extremism, and again, when this soldiers matrix erupts, everybody becomes very extreme and has to talk out. And in the presence of others, it is different. And we have tried this in other places, and we have succeeded in a mix of small and large group. But for the moment, what will happen in Israel is that this war, I think, will be decided by the United States in the end to stop. And then there will be a big fight between the left and the right, with a lot of demonstrations. I don't think we can do any other thing right now. We cannot, we don't have Trump on our side that sends the people to conquer the parliament. But I think what happens is it will take a lot of bleeding in the Israeli society. And the other thing is, I really don't know. My friend Bijan, he thinks the Iranian state is not so dangerous as it looks like. But we here in the north are trembling from having the Hezbollah on our borders. They just shoot into the houses, and we don't know what will happen. Yesterday we had an alarm in our city, and it was very frightening when you have, we had this already in 2006, but right now the Hezbollah is 10 times as strong as them.
Yes.
So really what will happen in the next months, it seems as if the Hezbollah doesn't want a total escalation. It seems as if the Iranian are not pushing them towards this, and it's a good sign. It seems that maybe there is some Saudi-Iranian togetherness, and this would help a bit this regional conflict in our place. I think so. This is what I think. But, at the moment, you look at all these places where they shoot rockets, and they in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, people, everybody has a little rocket under his bed, and he had a bad moment, he shoots.
Yeah, let's talk about that just a little bit. The power of non-state actors in mobilizing a war has massively increased. What do you think about that, John, from your perspective?
Well, one of the difficulties is that states have themselves been breaking down. And the West has made a massive contribution to the breakdown of statehood. We've gone into Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and in every single case, it has been a complete disaster and has resulted in a failed state. The United States supported the Saudis in their war with the Houthis. Well, that didn't work out terribly well. And I think the thing that we have to learn from all of that is that there is no military solution to these problems. Robbie has quite rightly been talking about the dangers from Hezbollah and others and all the rockets that are around. But of course, from their point of view, what they see is all the Israeli attacks. What Iran sees is all the Israeli attacks, the killing of some of their senior officials in other countries. I mean, it's not as though these people are in Israel or somewhere like that. They're attacked in Syria, they're attacked in Lebanon, they're attacked in Iran, they're attacked in all sorts of other places. And it's extraordinary, actually, that they have restrained themselves and not attacked back. One could have fully expected that there would have been such attacks Now, are they simply biding their time for something enormous? Who knows? We don't know the answer to that. But certainly, if there was a lion in a cage in the corner of my room here, I wouldn't spend my time poking sticks at it and throwing stones at it. I'd be trying to make friends with it in the knowledge that even if it did get out, it might devour me. But certainly, if I throw stones at it and hit it with sticks, it will definitely devour me when it gets a half a chance. So I think there's that side to it. Robbie says something very important about the need for all the citizens of Israel, all the Jewish citizens, and indeed, of course, by implication, all the non-Jewish citizens, that they should all be treated equally, that they should all have to pay their taxes or serve in the IDF or make their contribution or participate in an education. That's absolutely right. But that is not what has happened. In fact, it has been going in the opposite direction for quite a period of time. And one cannot dismiss that and say, well, that's not relevant to the conflict. I think it's very relevant to the conflict. What I'm not at all clear about is whether Israel can ever reverse that properly. And one of the reasons for that is because of the description of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. One of the objections I have to postmodernism is that they seem to feel sometimes, some of these philosophers, that if you say two conflicting things in one sentence, that makes them possible. That expressing a paradox makes it possible. It doesn't do anything of the sort. It just cons yourself into thinking that. And I'm not at all clear that there can be a Jewish and democratic state. I think there can be a Jewish state, and there are some people in Israel who desperately want it to be that way. And you can have a democratic state, in which case everybody has to be treated equally. But the problem about that is you cannot then entrench forever the culture that you want to see. That's the issue that's around in Europe at the moment. As you have immigration, you have people coming in with a different culture. Do you stick with being a liberal democratic country whose culture then encompasses all the differing cultures of those who come and live there? Or do you try to maintain something that becomes more and more of a minority or less than majority interest? So I think that these are the issues, not just between Jewish Israel and Muslim and Christian Palestinians and the region, but I think there's also the struggle for the very soul of Israel. What kind of country is it? And I think that's what you've seen on the streets of Israel, as well as the backdrop to this conflict.
That brings us really quite to the end of this conversation. You have raised massively complicated and powerful troubles that face all of us and rational solutions to them. But we are caught up in a maelstrom of irrationality. And so the question that faces all of us is, where do you bring the strands of rationality together to approach some kind of peacemaking solution? I guess we leave that question in the hands of our listeners. Thank you both for participating in this conversation.
And thank you, Ed, and indeed Robbie, for the opportunity to engage in it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.